welcome to another Sunday morning. 11:05, we're ready to get going, and I'd like to welcome our speaker today, Ruth Corman. Ruth is going to talk about her many and varied careers and her talents. Ruth is an artist, Ruth is an author.
No, stop.
Ruth is a blogger, and
a what?
A blogger.
Oh,
your wonderful blog and your wonderful short stories. I'm going to hand the microphone over virtually to Ruth. And Ruth.
I will begin, and here we begin. My parents were both Jewish, but theirs was considered a mixed marriage because Mum was from Leeds and Dad was from Manchester. And in those days, there was a health-free disregard by Mancunians towards Jews from the other side of the Pennines. They weren't that keen on Liverpudlians either. My maternal grandparents arrived in Leeds from Berdichev in the early 1900s, but father's side came from Poland much, much earlier. I'm actually the 5th generation England to be waving the British flag. I sometimes tell people I think I'm like an English Mayflower Jew, but they don't quite know what I mean by that. We lived in Cheetham Hill, Manchester. When I was 4, I began school at the nearby Notre Dame Catholic Convent, as it was considered the best school in the area. At the beginning of each school day, the nuns marched all of us into the chapel, and all their girls would dip their fingers in a murky-looking sponge in a stone niche on the wall, and then they'd do north, south, east and west. They do that bit. And I, not wanting to be different, there were 2 Jewish girls and I think 900 non-Jewish girls in the school. I would dip my finger in it, and then I'd look at my hand and I'd say, hey, hang on a minute, I don't do this, I'm Jewish. And I would surreptitiously wipe it on my skirt. My other recollections from the convent was being in a Christmas play. Do you remember those huge metal filing cabinets that were, I think they were kind of bottle green or whatever, huge, about 7 foot high? I was chosen to be an angel in the play, and part of my costume was a pair of ethereal, enormous feathered wings reaching to the heavens. I have never felt so close to heaven, and I doubt I ever will again. When I was 7, we moved to Prestwich in North Manchester, where there was a growing Jewish community.
You don't have to watch them.
Can you turn off the voices? Yeah. I continued at the convent for a few more months, which meant that from North Manchester, I had to walk 20 minutes to Heaton Park to catch a bus. I was on the bus for half an hour and then another 10 minutes walking to the school. Nobody in those days had any concerns about letting young children go out alone from a very early age. I think it probably made us very independent. Looking back, though, it seems we were in some ways naive and innocent about the world. I recall my mother saying to friends that she never knew anything at all about homosexuality until she married my father. Now, what she meant by this, it could be construed the wrong way. She meant to say it was he who first told her about it, which isn't so surprising when you realise they married in 1937, and it was another 30 years to 67 before it was legalised in Britain, and even in the mid-80s for Scotland and Ireland. One invaluable thing that I learned about at the convent was that if ever I lost anything, I could appeal to St. Anthony, and he would always help me to find it. It was very simple. Dear St. Anthony, please help me to find my homework. Whatever it was, he always did. When I met Charles, however, he disapproved when I told him this story, saying that in future I must appeal to Rabbi Hanania, who provides a similar service for Jews, although not unsurprisingly, in his case you have to make a donation. 2 weeks ago, I lost my hearing aids for a week. I looked absolutely everywhere and couldn't find them. I'd even made an appointment at the Royal Free to get another pair. As a last resort, though, I decided to give the rabbi another try, but he didn't respond. I assumed he couldn't hear me because maybe he'd also lost his hearing aids. Anyway, in desperation, I returned to my old friend Anthony, and in 5 minutes, guess what? They miraculously appeared. Stick to what you know works is my motto. In Prestwich, I started at the King's Road Primary School. In my class was Maureen Schenker, who remembers my arrival, seeing this very strange-looking creature, wearing a bottle green school uniform with a big hat with a big gold cross in the middle. I also wore enormous glasses, as I was cross-eyed after a bout of measles. Surprisingly, despite all this, she wanted to be my best friend, and we continued to grammar school, where, with the addition of Merle and Beryl, we established our gang of 4, which has survived until today, despite our living on different continents. Maureen and I go back 74 years. As girls, we were never ever encouraged by either school or parents to stay on to the 6th form and go to university. We were expected to leave at 16, work in an office or hairdressers, and then find somebody to marry. I went to Secretarial College for a year and then worked for a major advertising agency. They suggested it would be useful for me to learn a course in printing at the local tech. The course was called Reproduction. The first evening I arrived at the tech, I couldn't find where the lectures were held. I wandered down corridors, opening several doors and asking, "Is this the class for reproduction?" and was greeted by derisive male shouts saying, "Yes, come in," at every one of them. As was expected of me, I got engaged at 18 and married just after my 20th birthday. We moved to Middlesbrough in the northeast, and by age 24 I had 3 small boys. My husband worked in the steelworks, the director of a scrap reclamation company owned by his cousin Egon. For leisure breaks, I went to Billingham Ice Rink 2 afternoons a week learning to dance. And I could recall precisely the moment when, gliding endlessly round the ice, I had something of an epiphany. I thought to myself, is this my future? Mapped out for me, going round forever in never-ending anti-clockwise circles. And I resolved there and then to find some gainful employment. When Egon heard, he absolutely forbade me to go to work, saying that it was unacceptable for one of his directors to have a wife who was working. However, I was never very good at being told what to do, so my first job was working with an accountant. It was excruciatingly boring. The next was at a showroom selling pianos and organs. Their sales pitch was, "We will show you how to handle your organ." About this time, I was asked if I would teach at the local cheder. In my eyes, the idea was ludicrous as I knew so little.
Ruth Corman,
Sorry, I can't hear myself because we've got the voices on of people talking. Can we turn them off? Yeah. Yeah, I was sure the kids at the cheder would know more than me. My reaction was that of Groucho Marx, who once famously said, "I would never join a club that would have me as a member." So instead, we decided to move to Sunderland, where there were not only the requisite 2 synagogues, the one you go to, the one you not dream of going to, but also a good Jewish school for our boys. It was a good move. Durham City was close by, so one day I drove over to see it and fell totally in love with the city and decided to study for a degree at Durham University. I thought of doing law, but at the admissions hall, the queue for law was so long, I would never have got home in time to meet the boys from school. So I opted for the shortest queue, which was sociology. 3 years later, I got my 2-1. It's very curious to realise how such a prosaic incident can affect the major decisions of one's life. But I also enjoyed studying Italian there for a year. The day I received my degree, my parents and my boys came to the ceremony. My husband couldn't because he was giving up his job that same day, so I needed to go out to work. And about that time, I had a call from someone at the Adult Education Centre saying, would I teach Italian at the evening classes? In my head, I'd definitely decided not to. After all, I hadn't been qualified or anything like that, but I went along to meet him as arranged, to tell him in person. I walked into the lecture theatre where I was to meet him. There were about 40 or so people sitting there, eager and patiently at desks. As I entered, he said, here's your new teacher, Ruth Corman. What could I do? I felt so bad about this. So I thought I'd try and find out what it was that they wanted to learn. I said, are there any of you here who want to do exams? 3 hands went up. I said, you can't come to my class, you'd need a better class. There was a girl sitting on the front row, and I asked her, what is it you want to learn? And she said, all I want to know is how to say, are you very rich in Italian? You can stay, I said. And the rest of them were mostly pensioners who were with me for 2 evenings a week for 3 years using a language laboratory. They often fell asleep, but I thought, well, they're old, they need a little rest. I never woke them up. And we would also celebrate Christmas singing Funiculi Funicular and eating pasta. Basically, all they wanted to know was how to go to a restaurant and order food when you're on holiday in Italy. My day job was as organiser of Citizens Advice Bureau, CAB. Just shortly after I started, I visited Newcastle, where I heard people speaking in an incomprehensible language, which I thought was maybe Finnish or Norwegian. No, it was Geordie. I remember one client came into the CAB, very distressed, shouting, "Warlass, dinna give me my beer." I said, I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that. "Warlass, winna give me my beer." He said this 6 times. In the end, I had to call someone in to translate. He was saying, my wife wouldn't give me my packed lunch. I was really surprised, I can tell you, because I can understand a Londoner not understanding Geordie, but after all, I was a Northerner. When I took over the CAB in Sunderland, it had 1 small room and 8 volunteers. 5 years later, I had 4 bureaus, Sunderland being the main one, another one in Washington Newtown, one in Hittenley Hall and Hortonley Spring, both mining villages. I had a secretary and 54 volunteers who I trained. I also set up free ancillary services for people who couldn't afford it to get advice from lawyers, accountants, surveyors. And I also had an organisation that was designed to help the unemployed. It was almost all men at the time who came. It was to try to help them to set up their own businesses if they had no work, but they had a particular skill, decorating, plumbing, whatever it was. We would help them with the business side of how to set up tax things and this sort of thing. You can understand the need for this in Sunderland because when I was there, one part of the town had 90% unemployment. And the effects of this were spiral. It had a spiraling effect on the lives of so many families. A man would lose his job, he would lose his self-respect, he'd start drinking, he'd start beating up the wife. All of these issues we were dealing with on a daily basis. But I was lucky enough to appoint a really nice man called Ivor Saville, Jewish guy, whose business had gone bust a year ago, so he too was unemployed. He took it over, and it went from strength to strength and continued after I left the CAB. Also, after I'd left, I had a phone call from Ivor to say that I had a visit from Prince Charles. He never actually explained to me whether Prince Charles came as an honoured guest or whether he came perhaps looking for employment advice. During my time there, I was invited to join 2 committees in London. One was the Legal Action Group, and the second was the Lord Chancellor's Legal Aid Advisory Committee. My role was to inform these eminent Southern lawyers in London and about legal services in North. Picture the scene when I, as the only non-lawyer, only female, only provincial, Jewish but not black, joined this group. I remember attending my first reception with them at the President of the Law Society's apartment in Carey Street, overlooking the law courts. In those days, all non-Jews were very tall. I've checked this out with some other people, they all say yes, it was true. And I was there, it was like being in a forest, they're all in black suits. And there was me at 5 foot with all these 6'6" lawyers. It was like being in a forest of black trees. The president approached me and peered down. "I do hope the gentlemen of my Law Society's Council are not intimidating you," he said. I looked up at him. "No?" I said, "I regard the gentlemen of your Law Society's Council as Cecil B. DeMille used to regard his women." Suddenly there was a pause, and I was aware that all these gentlemen were listening. Cecil B. DeMille used to say, "I believe in putting my women on a pedestal so that I can smile down benignly at them." There was a pause. I could hear brains ticking over as they were taking in what I'd said, and suddenly it was, "Ho, ho, 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 how very droll, oh, ho, 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 how droll." And I always felt that once I tackled the Law Society full frontally, I could probably do anything on the planet. Some months later, I was invited to address their annual 3-day conference in Harrogate. I had a riveting topic. It was welfare benefits in relation to matrimonial proceedings. I knew absolutely nothing about it, but I researched it with a young barrister friend, and after 5 weeks, I was ready to be launched onto my unsuspecting public. The day arrived. It was undoubtedly my biggest challenge ever. I drove down to Harrogate, stayed there overnight, and the next morning there were several hundred lawyers, quite a few of them from the Lord Chancellor's department. And I thought, what am I doing to think of doing this? How can I do it? But I started with a joke, a fairly poor joke. I told how in the CAB clients come in asking for infertility benefit, that there was a benefit then called invalidity, but they hadn't quite got them sorted out, they didn't know the difference. The audience laughed, they didn't fall asleep, and the lecture thankfully was a success. I was euphoric with relief, and subsequently, quite ridiculously, became known as an expert in this field, even writing articles for the Law Society's Gazette. After the talk, a group of us went to someone's room. We were sitting, chatting and drinking, and I suddenly felt really, really sad because I realised that it was so long since I'd done anything as frivolous as being in a group and at a party and laughing and joking. A week after that, a young girl came to the bureau on a Friday afternoon quite late. She was very distressed and told me how she had been regularly raped by her father and her grandfather for some time. When I hear this sort of thing, or when I used to hear it, I just wanted to hug them, but of course you can't do that, even then. At the same time I thought, oh, this is a bore. I'm going to be home late for Shabbat. And when I realised that, I thought, if I can feel like this, it's time for me to stop. I and my team had been responsible for advising 32,000 clients a year. And after 5 or 6 years, I guess the burden of dealing with these problems on a day-to-day basis had become too bleak. And so I moved, this time to work as an industrial development officer in the new town of Peterlee, about 20 minutes drive from Sunderland. On my first day, I made a great impression, literally, when I opened a filing cabinet in the general office and out fell a litre bottle of black ink all over their cream carpet. A definite impression. After being so busy in the CAB, working at Peterlee was as if time ceased. I would look at my watch endlessly during the day and it never seemed to move. There was simply not enough work to do. I remember on one occasion I wrote a memo to the chief executive about a particular project saying, the rationale for this is so and so and so and so. I was called to the deputy chief executive officer. He said, Ruth, you mustn't use words like rationale with the CE. And I said, why not? He said, he won't understand it. The building was full of rules. Staff members were never permitted to come in through the main entrance, which was closest to where we came in. We had to drive round a long way to the back and then walk 20 minutes back to go in through a staff entrance. Now, Peterlee was not renowned for its climate, and often it was windy and rainy and snowing. And I thought, to hell with this, I am definitely not walking around 20 minutes in this. And I remember every day the receptionist would write down, Ruth Corman came through the wrong entrance. My job as part of a team was to attract businesses to come to Peterlee, which was a development area with government financial incentives being offered to companies who decided to relocate. I travelled regularly to London to meet many of the Japanese trading companies. That was my particular job. And as a woman, this was complex, as to establish a working relationship with the Japanese, you could only go in at a certain level, a level of which they considered appropriate. In other words, I could never meet anybody of a higher status, but equally I could not meet anybody of a lower status. In Peterlee, we organised events with promotional films showing Peterlee with endless glorious sunsets and beaches and warm weather. But all I remember of these events was seeing many of the local men furtively clutching bottles of the booze under their raincoats and leaving. However, one day we got some very important information. The Japanese company Nissan were coming to Peterlee. When overseas companies came, it was usual to put their national flag on the roof of this very high building. The day of their visit arrived. The flag was in place. I decided to go to see the chief executive, and I went to say that I was very concerned to see that the flag was hanging upside down. He and his deputies rushed to the roof, saw the flag, promptly took it down and rehung it the other way up. Now, as probably some of you will have realised, you can't really do that because the Japanese flag is a red circle on a white background. Whichever way you look at it, it's the same. This effort of mine, if you can call it that, this was undoubtedly the most satisfying achievement of my year at Peterlee. I smile every time I remember it. It occurred a week before I handed in my notice, and when I told them I was leaving, they didn't believe me. But why? They said, why? I said, because I can no longer work in this monolith of pettifogging bureaucracy. I applied for the job as Northern Director of the British Israel Chamber of Commerce and was interviewed in London, where 6 of the great and the good of the Jewish world awaited me. At Euston Station, I bought a copy of the Financial Times, opened it, closed it, crumpled it, and carried it into the meeting. I placed it in front of me of the table where I sat down. Neither did I carry a handbag. I noticed with satisfaction the surprised glances of approval when they saw the paper. Not for a second would they have guessed that I'd never read a single word of it, either that day or ever before, or since. It worked, and I was appointed. Subject to meeting the Manchester chairman, Sir David Alliance, he was David Alliance then, we met. He was impressive and a true gentleman. I passed with flying colours, being told later that he'd phoned the London office saying, "She's wonderful, she's just like a man." I found this amusing, but I suppose that his being an Iranian, this was probably the highest accolade a woman could ever receive. At my first Manchester committee meeting, I met the local dignitaries. It was reminiscent of the Last Supper, they being seated around this long boardroom table. There were 2 empty chairs, one at the head of the table, another down near the bottom. I decided to sit in the chair at the top of the table. The people round the table looked sort of nervously at me as I did this, and I said, "You appointed me as director, so I will direct. Had you wanted a glorified secretary, you have come to the wrong person." This job, I felt, was something I was destined to fulfill. My mum was a dedicated wheat sow lady, endlessly organising bazaars to aid the nation state of Israel. And my first business venture was sitting in the street, aged 8, with a little box in front of me, selling my old comics and toys to help the poor children in Israel. The objective of the chamber was to promote imports from Israel and create markets there for British goods. I had 4 regional chairmen with offices in Glasgow, Liverpool, Leeds and Manchester, the main one. My role was to organise promotional events, visit local businessmen to encourage them to engage in bilateral trade and eventually take them on missions to Israel. I spent hours driving along motorways. I remember the first company I ever visited, and I said, "Do you know anything about Israel?" "Oh yes," he said, "they have a crack army and they sell oranges." Well, it was a start. The first major event I promoted was called British Israel Techno Trade Day. In those days, technology was just beginning to come, especially from Israel. Shlomo Argov, the Israeli ambassador in London, was to be our guest of honour. But 10 days before the event, he was attacked by terrorists whilst leaving the Dorchester Hotel. He survived, but was paralysed and needed constant medical attention for the rest of his life. We were all in shock, but the event went ahead, chaired by the Duke of Devonshire, who held aloft an Israeli flag, saying he was proud to make this gesture of solidarity with Israel. The audience of 180 were on their feet in spontaneous applause. It was very, very moving. I'm getting a shiver now even telling you about it. Marcus Seif was our president, a quite unforgettable character. I remember meeting him and Lily, his wife, at their London apartment. Whilst there, I visited their bathroom and I saw this magnificent set of men's hairbrushes. It looked like ebony and it was silver initials, M and S, on the top of each one, and I made a mental note to go to the store and buy a pair. It was only when returning to their living room, I was almost going to mention it, and then suddenly I thought, oh crumbs, no. It probably isn't the logo for Marks and Spencer's. It's probably Marcus Seif's initials. In addition to organised conferences in 1981, we created BIG, B-I-G Day, Buy Israeli Goods. The following year, it became Big Week. It was 8 days. I suppose that is a big week if it's 8 days. And by 1983, it was a month. As the press said, the taste of Israel got bigger and better. Several Israeli companies took over factories in the north that were going to close, thus saving lots of jobs. And Tadiran Electronics were the first to introduce silicone chips and semiconductors to the British market. Tadiran, interestingly, also produced the very first drone. We hear a lot about drones today, and I'd always thought they were something very new. But Tadiran first flew theirs in 1973. In 1983, we took the largest ever mission of businessmen, 30 British industrialists, to Israel. They visited several major Israeli companies, Core, Palgat Textiles, Israel Aircraft Industries, and the Citrus Marketing Board, amongst others. It was at the Citrus Marketing Board that one of our group, after a tour, asked their chief executive, "What on earth do you do with all these oranges?" To which he replied, "We eat what we can, and we can what we can't." Nobody in those far-off days could ever have envisaged the giant leap that Israel has taken since then. There is scarcely a single part of our lives that is not enhanced by the amazing technology coming out of such a tiny country. When I began with them in 1980, trade figures reached 232 million. 2 years ago, it was almost £7 billion, and still continues. As for the future, the UK and Israel recently signed a post-Brexit trade agreement, which it said to deliver significant savings and help safeguard British jobs. One major company involved being Teva Pharmaceuticals, who they're the largest manufacturer of generic medicines in the world, and they supply the NHS. I remained with the Chamber for 4 or 5 years, until one day, whilst attending a major event in Liverpool, I met an embassy official who told me that a new organisation, the British Israel Arts Foundation, were looking for a director and I should apply. I thought nothing more of it until, whilst driving back to Manchester late that night, I fell fast asleep at the wheel. It was very, very scary. This, to me, was the sign that I had to stop driving around so much and try to find a job in one place. I applied to the British Israel Arts Foundation. It was Jane Moonman, the chairman of BIPAC, the director of BIPAC, who introduced me to the proposed chairman of the new group, Lillian Hochhauser. Lillian interviewed me. After only 5 minutes, she said, "You'll be perfect for the job." I said, "Are you sure? You hardly know me." To which she replied, "Yes, I'm sure." I accepted the offer. Of course, many of you will know Lillian, who is actually a member at South Hampstead. Coincidentally, nobody could possibly have had a better chairman than her, as few could match her professionalism in arranging music events in both Britain and Israel. Others on the committee were Arnold Wesker, whose original idea it was, Lord Weidenfeld, Trevor Chin, Sir Trevor Chin now, and representatives from both the Israel Embassy, and we worked very closely with the British Council. For the first few months, I worked every day meeting anyone and everyone involved in art or culture in Israel to see how we could cooperate. We then had our official launch in 1985. It was at Christie's in St James. 250 guests there saw our exhibition called Printmakers from Israel, which included 14 very well-known artists, Kadishman, Hadani, Smilansky, Kovner, Ullman, many around and still famous today. And we also had a recital by the Yuval Piano Trio. Music critic David Sonin wrote, "I hope the quality of the BIAF's programme, launched so elegantly at Christie's last night, will continue to match its initial offerings." Praise indeed from David, who was renowned for his acerbic comments. He reviewed their concert that same week in the Queen Elizabeth Hall and wrote, "The Yuval Trio is world class. One would have hoped that the audience might have behaved better. A wave of latecomers, coughs, rustling programmes, chatter, and the opening of handbags would have unnerved lesser musicians. I recommend that ladies must check in their bags before the start, and under no circumstances should programmes be sold before the end of the concert." I doubt anyone heeded his advice then or since. We also launched the first exhibition of Israeli architecture in the UK at the Royal Institute of British Architects in London. It was fascinating. I loved it because I'd actually always had a sort of fancy being an architect, but couldn't because I couldn't do maths. I learned there about Tel Aviv being called the White City because it was the first city in the whole world to be built almost entirely in international style or Bauhaus. We also offered other Israel-specific topics such as solar energy architecture, kibbutz architecture, and a lot of restoration projects in Jaffa and Jerusalem. In Jerusalem it was the Cardo, and Jaffa various things, and also Bedouin villages and work with the communities there. Leading architects, including Moshe Safdie, who some of you will know of, spoke at the show, and then this exhibition we sent to 6 university cities with the lecturers. Later in the year, I organised an architectural trip to Israel for anyone who was interested. We had to produce 3 programmes each year, including about 10 events. Each one had about 10 events in. Some of these events stand out particularly in my memory. One was the visit of the Kibbutz Dance Company. They toured to 7 cities and also performed in London. In York, the local paper wrote, "Where else can you find a modern dance company composed entirely of farm workers from agricultural settlements? This company is unique and of an impressively high standard." What on earth did the journalists expect? Were they expecting to see yokels with straws in their mouths carrying garden implements? In London, I asked them to give a free performance. Well, they were paid, but we gave a free performance at the Place Theatre of Peter and the Wolf. It was for 600 underprivileged school children, included in which was a group of 50 who were blind. Someone at the time said to me, "Ruth, what's the point of inviting blind children?" And I told her, if you say to a blind person, "You must never go where you can't see," they would never go anywhere. The audience were spellbound, cheering and clapping. At the end, we invited the blind children up on stage to meet the cast. They were stroking the faces of the dancers and touching their costumes. Some of them were furry like animals. And it made me realise how art can bring joy to everyone. That day will be remembered forever, not just by me, but certainly by the children and the dancers. 1987 was Ben Gurion's centenary year. We had a galaxy of musicians, so many things. But 1988 was an even more spectacular year, it being the 40th anniversary of the state. A number of Jewish organisations, including ours, joined together to provide a major event at Alexandra Palace called the Heart of Israel. I have never in my life worked so hard. Apart from the preparation of this, I was there from 10 in the morning until nearly 11 at night. We had choirs, theatre, a lecture about the boat on the Sea of Galilee from the time of Jesus, the Camry Theatre, Habri Rahati, much, much, much more. And I also brought the exhibition by David Ruminger and David to this event. It was called Witness to an Era. 20 years later, of course, I wrote his life story. Another special event at Alexandra Palace was the presence of the Male Gwyn Male Voice Choir, a 70-strong group of miners from North Wales. They said to me, could they come to Alexandra Palace to sing, to say thank you to me and our group for organising their visit to Israel a few months earlier. I went with them. Not only was this Israel's 40th anniversary, but it was the 400th anniversary of the translation of the Bible into Welsh in 1588. A booklet was produced dealing with all the links between the two. There were many, many links. I think it was a Welsh regiment that marched into Jerusalem to free it from the Turks, all sorts of things. But while they were in Israel, they visited Kfar David. Now, you would think it would be named after David Ben-Gurion or King David, but no, it was named after David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister. There were 200 in this group. We had 3 buses. Mostly they were all called either Jones or Williams, Evans, Roberts, Hughes, Griffiths, Morgan. It was actually quite difficult for the passport officials when they arrived at Ben Gurion, as there were 36 Williams in the group. I spent a lot of time with them. It was quite joyous. I remember when we drove them from Jerusalem to Rehovot, we stopped on the way to a cafe for something to eat. We were filling the restaurant, the 200, there was 70 singers and the rest were family. Suddenly, one man in a far corner starts to sing, and then it's picked up by someone over here and someone over here and there, and suddenly the whole choir was singing, and I can't even describe it. I'm getting a shiver again telling you. It reached to the heavens. It was so special. While they were on the bus, they said to me, Ruth, can you teach us an Israeli song? We'd like to sing one tonight at the concert. And I thought, what can I teach them? So I decided on Hevenu Shalom Aleichem, because it was only 3 words. And they all wrote it on their arm, on a bit of paper, or on the collar of the man who they knew they'd be standing behind. And we practiced it on the bus. It was this that they added to their repertoire in London. And it raised the roof not only in Alexandra Palace, but also in Rehovot. I'm still in touch with them, by the way. Roger Roberts is now a minister, Labour minister, and I see him not regularly, not often enough, but he's very special. However, something else happened that same year, which had the greatest impact on my life. I was invited to visit, when I was in Israel, the Rosh Ha'ayin Mandolin Orchestra, comprising 40 girls from Yemenite families, with a view to bringing them over to the UK. As arranged, I sat waiting at the Hilton Hotel for someone to pick me up. I waited an hour and a half, and it was in the evening. I was tired, and I was just on the point of leaving when the driver arrived and drove me over to Rosh Ha'ayin. I met the girls, I fell in love with them, and I arranged a 7-city UK tour. I remember in Cardiff they were singing in a church, and on the wall at the end there was an enormous 10-foot sculptural statue of Jesus, and they all refused to sing unless it was covered. So we had to cover it with a sheet. I hope the parishioners understood. They also appeared on TV with Sir Harry Seacombe. In every place they stayed, I arranged that they would stay with local families. This was 7 cities. And in London, we arranged to host 4 of them when they were here for their Queen Elizabeth Hall concert. 2 of the girls, Tally and Eddie, were sisters, and I had the conductor and his assistant on my list. I had to collect them near the Heath from their bus, and as I told them they were coming, one of the girls said, she'd had a row with the conductor, she said, I'm not going there, I'm not coming to your house, no, I'm not coming. Very dramatic. It took me 10 minutes, exhaustingly, to persuade her to come. Eventually, she did. That Friday evening, I invited my son Charles to join us for Shabbat. 2 months later, he went to Israel to visit Tally. A year later, they married. I now have 3 half-Yemenite grandchildren, the eldest of whom, Danielle, has given me 3 gorgeous great-granddaughters, aged 8, aged 6, and aged 2, and another one will be delivered, sex unknown, the first week of September. Don't you think that this is the best perk that anyone could wish for in any job? If it hadn't been for that job, I wouldn't have had them. I continued working with the foundation for another 10 years. I've made lifelong friendships with so many talented artists, many of whom I'm still in touch with, about writing stories for my blog. There's still 10, 15, 16 more years to write about my career, but I decided that this was a very good point to end. I will show you this. Can I show it you? How do I do it? There. That's my beautiful son and my even more beautiful daughter-in-law. And all I can say is, if you want to know any more about what happened, just watch this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you very much. I'm going to open up for questions. I'm just going to go to gallery view. But firstly, Ruth, you are the most amazing storyteller. You really are. And the way you can recollect all the things that have happened to you is quite amazing. But you talk in such a beautiful way. That was a real treat.
Even with my accent.
Even with your accent. It makes it even more beautiful. There we are. But how do you remember all these details? It's just amazing.
Well, it's quite nice, this story. It's thanks to COVID. It's thanks for lockdown. Sure. I am an obsessive, I'm OCD. I'm always tidying, always throwing things away, always clearing up. I was clearing out a cupboard. I found a box like this with programs, press cuttings, photographs, brochures, all relating to all my occupations. I cannot believe I never chucked them out. And as I was going through these, and because I was in lockdown and I couldn't go out looking for new adventures for my blog, I thought I'd write up some of them. And it's been really, I actually feel tired reading how much I did. I don't really understand how I managed to do it, but it happened.
Oh, that's wonderful. If you'd like to raise your hand, if you've got any questions. Linda, I'm going to unmute yourself. No,
can't hear you, Linda. Can't hear you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Right, good. Ruth, I'm absolutely in awe of what you've achieved. We are of similar vintage. And I just am gobsmacked because when I got engaged, I was told in no uncertain terms by my mother-in-law, my future mother-in-law, the women in this family don't work. Our job was to set up home and have children and be a wonderful wife and hostess. Now that wasn't just me, that was all my friends, those with degrees and whatever, and professional women, and that's what we did. Even the professional women, once they were married, they had to give up their jobs until their children were independent, and if they went back to work, it was part-time. You have achieved so much. Did you come across any sexism? Did you have any people that are against what you did? Because you've achieved a hell of a lot.
You can't see me. Oh, have I got? Yeah. It's an interesting. I've had, since I wrote the story about that period, I had quite a lot of senior ladies like you and me writing to say, yes, that happened to me. But there were two incidences at the time that I remember. I was never aware then of sexism. I was never involved in women's lib. I applauded what they were doing, but I would never have burnt my bra. I mean, you know, these sort of things. And frankly, I was looking after 3 boys. My husband was ill. I eventually divorced. I was having to work, and I never thought about it. But I remember once going to the hospital in Middlesbrough, or was it Sunderland? It doesn't matter. I had a wart on my thumb, and I thought, oh, this is irritating me. I'll go and get it removed. So I go to the hospital, and I say, can you just take this off, please? And they take me up to a ward. They make me dress into a gown. They put me on a bed. There was a hole in the gown through which my thumb peered. And the doctor was there, and I was surrounded on this bed by 8 medical students and the doctor. The doctor is looking at my thumb, and he said, you know, Ruth, don't you, that if we cut this out, it's going to be quite uncomfortable. How will you manage to type? So I said, no problem at all. I said, I will wave this hand to my secretary and he will do my typing.
Wonderful.
The other occasion I remember, when I was working for the chamber, trade, industry, this stuff, and I was invited by my mother's wheat sow group, 60 ladies passionate about Israel, to talk about my work with the British Israel Chamber of Commerce. I gave them a hard-hitting talk about international trade relations and this and exports and imports, and I finished. And at the end, Lady Chairman said, have any of you ladies any questions for Mrs. Cohn? And one lady at the front said, yes, she said, I've got a question. She said, while you're out doing all these amazingly important things, who's at home looking after your 3 boys?
That's how it was.
Yeah, that's how it was.
Anyone else would like to ask Ruth a question? I'm just trying to see, raise your hand. Ralph? Rafe, I can see, I don't know if you're just pressing a button or you've got a question. No.
Lisa wants to ask the question as well.
Who?
Hello.
Oh, hi.
Hi. I just wanted to say that not all women were expected to work only in the house. My mother was a scientist, and in fact, it saved our lives when we came from Vienna to Edinburgh in 1939. And she was a very good mother at the same time too, and I don't think anybody dared ask as to who was home looking after her daughter. And I studied medicine at Edinburgh, and I think there was a quota. I think we were 20% of the students, but I find that a lot of young people today view me as a curiosity or a freak, but we weren't really. I still remember in the generation before, there were some women at Edinburgh University, there were some women surgeons, one of them Jewish, very distinguished. So I think that one has to remember that at any rate, you know, in certain circles, women already, and my mother in a very feminine way, did work and were accepted as such, even in a traditional Jewish background. Thank you.
I'm delighted to hear it. Maybe Manchester was a bit different.
No, I think London.
All the guys I knew went to university. None of the girls, not one.
Ruth, our generation, Jewish women, it's Linda, our generation, sort of Jewish women, we were expected. Even I have several friends who went to university, but once they got married, they were at home raising their families until such a time when their children were independent. Then they went back to work and eventually, I suppose, full time. But at the beginning, we knew our place. I don't think anybody argued. We wanted to be there to make a home and for the family, but not like you. You were fantastic. I'm really, really admire for what you've achieved.
Yes. No, you don't need to.
Ruth, I'm aware of the time. Oh, hold on, I have a question. Andrea.
It isn't actually a question. It's just I've really enjoyed all these talks, and Ruth, that was fascinating, because I also went to university, and I was the only Jewish lady or person that I knew that went to university. And when I got married, Linda, who knew my parents-in-law well, my father-in-law told me that I wasn't allowed to work anymore because married women didn't work. Right. And I laughed and I carried on working, and they never forgave me.
Yes, I can see that.
Ruth, I just want to ask you what you mentioned very briefly in your talk. You mentioned the books, or you mentioned one book, which was the writing David Rubinger's biography, 60 Years Through My Lens. Yes, which I have as well. I'm very proud to tell you we do have that book.
Yeah.
You've also written another book called Unexpected Israel. Can you just for a few minutes tell us a little bit about that?
I got concerned 12 years ago about the negative image that Israel was always receiving in the press. It was ever thus, I suppose, but I wanted to try and do my bit. I had a very good friend in Israel, Alon Galili, who was an amazing guide and a man of the earth, and very special. And we became friends, and every time I was in Israel, I said, I want you to show me unexpected Israel, different things. He said, no problem. And we travelled, and with him, I saw Israel from Eilat up to the northern border. And I had all these notes that I'd written, and then somebody said, why don't you put it into a book? And I thought maybe that would be a good way of doing it. Unexpected Israel. I'm not trying to sell it to you, honestly, but I've got some if you want them. No, it's the Rubinger book sold 20,000, I think, and that's still. I still get huge checks from New York for, what was it, $17, the last one. But it's what's lovely. It's lovely to have it because when I can give it to people, it's like giving them a part of me. I've been also writing a blog for 8 years. It's being read in 78 countries so far by I don't know how many thousands of people. And I've never had a single negative email, in spite of me standing up there. I'm Jewish, I'm Israeli, I've had an Israeli passport for 38 years. And I get the opposite effect. Because I'm a Gabby Northerner, I talk to people all the time, and there's not a day goes by that I don't pick up 2 or 3 people in the street or in Marks and Spencer's or Waitrose, as was. I can't do that now. And not one single person has ever intimated to me anything negative about Israel. No, we want to go, we want to visit. The only negative person was a Jewish lady in Marks and Spencer. I don't approve of what Israel's doing, she said. I said, have you ever been? And she said, oh, yes, I was there 19 years ago. And I thought, well, get off your backside and go. And I didn't say that, of course, but they're the hard, I can't, that I can't deal with. But everyone else is going to Israel, writing to me. I get about 120 emails every month from people all over the place who I don't know. And it's just very, I'm carrying on my tradition from my mum. She was passionate about Israel with wheat sow. And I just think that's what I've inherited from my mum, who was also a mover.
Ruth, it's Tom. Could you please tell everybody how to access your blog?
You can either send me your email via Lawrence, and then you'll be on my list. Or if you want to go yourself, then I won't have you, I can't send you things every month if you're not on my list. It's ruthcorman.wordpress.com. If you are in touch with me, I can send you an attachment that I made, which lists on one list the title of every story over the past 8 years and what it's about. Otherwise, you just have to scroll through the screen all the time, which would be very tiresome for you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Any other questions? Can you raise a hand? Hold on, let me go.
Hannah.
Annie, is that you?
Annie? No, I'm not sure. Someone's turning on or off their computer or got a question. No.
David, is it you?
Andrew. Andrew, have you got a question?
Susie has.
Susie?
Susie Kaufman here. From one Geordie to another, I thought your talk was absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, really.
Let me just tell you, Susie,
Yes.
you must meet me. You must come and meet me because it's.
Well, I do. I met you recently and we talked, and
that's right.
When all this is over, this stupid pandemic, or we can meet outside, I'd like to have a good old chat with you. In Geordie.
You'll appreciate this. When I went to Durham to do my degree, the Jewish community was so disapproving. And they'd say things, the men would say, oh, you're going to get so clever, we won't be able to talk to you. I mean, how ridiculous is this?
Totally ridiculous.
I only sort of realised it in retrospect, funnily enough.
And I must add that I was also convent educated during the week, and Gates said educated in the girls' seminary for my Jewish education. So there you go.
Okay, everybody. Ruth, thank you for a very positive hour. It was very special, and everyone involved with SHtory thanks you.
Lawrence, what can I just say one more thing? All I want from people who read my blog is that they might smile for 1 minute at anything I write, because to me, humour is the thing that carries you through, especially these days. I try not to read the papers, it's all pretty dismal. And I feel that if I can lift people's spirits, even for 1 minute, that is all I want.
Thank you. A very good note to end on. Thank you.